Hello and welcome to the first session of WordPress Multisite 101 with Tom Woodward. I'm here with Tom Woodward and Jim Groom. I'm Amanda Schmidt, and we are very excited to take you through the first session of this month-long workshop series on all about WordPress Multisite, anything you'd want to know about it. And today is going to kind of be establishing our foundation. We are going to talk about mainly the advantages and disadvantages of WordPress multi-site, get into those meat and potatoes, and also talk about what setups look like, and just kind of give you the broad picture to get us ready and raring to go for the rest of the month. So thank you, Tom, for being with us. And we're ready when you are.
All right. It is a pleasure to be here with both of you. So the reason I think that I am involved in this particular project is that I have worked with WordPress multi-site for many years. I think Jim said decade earlier. That's probably true and sort of terrifying because this aging thing kind of slips up on you, right? But it started off, really the major stuff with WordPress multi-site for me was at Virginia Commonwealth University with a site called Rampages, where I got to work with Dr. Gardner Campbell, and we set up kind of a massive vision for what a giant community WordPress site might be, and the fact that none of the accounts would ever be deleted, and you know, like it would grow forever because the stuff they're making is beautiful and should be preserved. So super cool, but it came with lots of challenges. I think the site is now around 37,000 sites. I no longer work at VCU, and other people are trying to figure out what to do with this site now. But yeah, roughly 37,000 sites and about 3,500 users. So a big site. And for a large portion of that time, it was kind of just me doing most of the support for this. So lots of the things I learned were around kind of how to make this scale to very little very little human capital, as well as kind of learning the hard way about lots of things that I should have done and lots of technical details that would have been much better kind of sussed out at the beginning. So I don't know everything about WordPress multi-site, certainly, but I have learned a lot, and hopefully throughout these sessions, I'll be able to save you headaches and pain and suffering that I endured firsthand, sometimes for months at a time. So that's my bona fides. I'm happy to have anyone challenge them.
We'll take it.
All right, all right.
What are they saying? Oh, brother, where art thou? He's bona fide.
I think so. I think so. I put in my time. And Reclaim's been helpful for us throughout that whole process. Like, we were with WP Engine and we had to move over and we had to do a lot of crazy stuff. So, you know, other people have bled and sweated through this thing as well, including poor Matt Roberts, who's stuck there with it now. Love you, Matt. I'm sorry.
That could be a whole different stream, couldn't it?
Yes. Well, how about you want me to get started, and I'll just kind of describe what WordPress multi-site is for those of us who don't know?
Perfect.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So what WordPress multi-site lets you do is, ordinarily, you might have a domain in one's own instance, or you might be familiar with individual WordPress sites. So those things kind of live in isolation. You know, you put a plugin there, a theme there, it's there for just that site. If you, as somebody trying to help a bunch of people with a bunch of different sites, need to get in there, they're going to have to add you as a user, or maybe you can log in via cPanel if you got a domain of one's own, kind of super admin path or something like that. But in any case, each of these things exist as islands in a sea, and nothing they do impacts anyone around them, as well as you can't really act on them at scale very easily. What WordPress Multisite does is it kind of brings you into one group where you have individual sites, but when you install plugins, when you activate themes, in the majority of cases, they're all available across all the sites that kind of live on this multi-site. And you, as a super admin, can hop into all those places and do whatever you need to do. You can activate plugins so that people can't turn them off. You can have certain plugins on by default. You have a lot of different choices that help you work across a community in ways that are really nice. So benefits, you make the decisions about what themes and plugins are present as the super admin. The negative of that is you're making those decisions. You know, I talk a lot about polarity in these cases. You could say you get no plugins and one theme. You could say, as I think we did on Rampages, you get like, I don't know, 100 themes and 300 plugins. There's a lot of distance between those two poles where you're trying to figure out how much complexity can you take, what's it like for the users. There's a lot to think through there, and you as a super admin are kind of responsible for doing that thinking and for dealing with the complexity that you allow and create. I think there's a happy middle ground where you can give a lot of choice and enable a lot of flexibility, but not so much that it begins to drown you. Another advantage to WordPress Multisite is it's one place to update themes and plugins. You don't have to rely on people kind of keeping things up to date. You can do it centrally and make sure you're running kind of safe and modern plugins. Downside of that is if there's a problem with any of those updates or any of those things, it spreads, right? It tends not to be contained to just one site. The other thing I mentioned previously is you can kind of hop between sites to help people out, and that is wonderfully awesome. And there are some plugins that also let you kind of switch and emulate different users, kind of like Canvas's Masquerade, or lots of other ways that people kind of pretend to be somebody else, which can be really handy. I don't know that there's a whole lot of negative to that, other than like be careful about how much you help and to what degree, and set some reasonable boundaries there for yourself. Another great thing about WordPress Multisite is you control the sign in, sign up process, and you can customize that. That can be really important when you're trying to figure out what sort of data you need to show success, and kind of what kind of experience you want people to have as they join this community. Negatives there is you have to do it, or you have to think about it, or you just get what's default, which probably is not going to be quite what you need. So there's a little bit of thinking through your big project, thinking through experience from the user's end to make this good, interesting, informative, while gathering just enough information. Because if you ask for too much, people stop. You ask for too little, you end up not being able to know what you need to know. The other nice thing about WordPress Multisite is it's easier to see community activity. It's really hard, as you may already know, to kind of get a sense of what's going on across a bunch of separate WordPress sites. You know, you can subscribe via RSS, you can do some things like that, but they're kind of require you as a human to organically go out and like add these RSS feeds and know that the site is there to do it. And, you know, and it's not a thing that you can share necessarily very easily. But WordPress Multisite, you can see across all these sites and see when they're last updated. You can run database queries in interesting ways. With different plugins, you can create activity streams from everything happening across the entire network. And that can be like a really awesome and beautiful thing when you're trying to create community and when you're trying to get people to see what other people are doing and become inspired by it. Negatives of that are aspects of privacy. And that's a bigger and bigger deal now, and trying to figure out, like, how do we get students and faculty thinking about aspects of privacy in these sorts of environments in ways that aren't, again, at that idea of polls. Not everything needs to be 100% in the open for the world, and not everything needs to be locked down as if it's your deepest, darkest secret that you never want anyone to know about. So what's the middle ground, and how does that impact activity streams and education and sign up experience? It's an additional element of complexity, but a good and worthwhile one, in my opinion. And then I think finally, like, what you may see is what people want is WordPress. If that's what they want, they just want WordPress, then it makes sense to give it to them. If they don't want cPanel, they don't want to look at databases, they don't want any of the additional complexities that are also opportunities, I mean, don't force it on them. Give them this, straightest path to what people want. I think that's most of the advantages. And I think really what you're looking at with a community always is that it's more complex. It's more complex technically. It's more complex interrelationships of plugins and themes. People are going to want to do strange things on there. You have to decide whether you're going to let them. How will it impact the neighbors, so to speak? And then you have to realize, like, any flaw in the system tends to be a global one. So if you get hacked, or there are security concerns of that type, that is going to impact far more people. So you have to be cautious, because every action has greater chance of repercussions. And the larger your community grows, the larger your vulnerability is, and the more impactful any options, any, I guess, intrusions on your site are.
Tom, I really like that you bring up the idea of the complexity of WordPress multi-site, whereas you have the single WordPress install in, say, a cPanel, as you referenced. But then when you have WordPress multi-site as an admin, one of the things you're taking on is the complexity of the WordPress multi-site database, which is significantly different than the one-off WordPress database. And that's a big shift as becoming the admin. And it's both a power, because, like, for all the reasons you said, you can manage more users, you can make more themes and plugins accessible, etc. But then you have to learn essentially a whole new topography of database to make sure you can manage that long term.
Right. And it's, it depends too on how much time you spend in the database. A lot of people I know admin WordPress sites and maybe have never seen the WordPress database. So, I mean, it's not a necessity, but if you are very familiar with the database as it is in a single install, the multi-site, and certainly what Rampages is, a sharded multi-site, is gonna take a little bit of reorientation.
Yeah, and also we have mentioned it, or we haven't mentioned it. It's worth mentioning. It changes the way in which you think through backups, right? So one of the big differences, advantages, disadvantages with a WordPress single install versus a WordPress multi-site is you can basically, roll back a single install fairly simply, and because it's isolated, you get that back up in all the files, etc. With a WordPress multi-site, if one site amongst many loses information or data, or has a hack, or it becomes a kind of, all of that often has to be rolled back. And that's something we often discuss with admins, about thinking through various backup procedures. Are there plugins that you could maybe offload to S3, like Updraft Plus and stuff, so to maybe have other options? Because sometimes with WordPress multi-site backups, it can be a little bit more nuclear than you're used to with one-offs.
Right. I think about it a lot like an apartment building, versus a single house on, like, a big field, right? Like, you can do whatever you want in your house. and it doesn't really impact a whole lot. And you can probably return it to state pretty easily because like it's just a one thing in a big field. But like if you pull if you blow up an apartment in the middle of this complex building, you can't just go in there very easily and like plug a new apartment in. It's because it's impacting your neighbors. You have to think about all this stuff. Maybe it blew the ceiling out of the guy upstairs. Who knows? But like that's how I try and get people to think about like this interrelationship is that you're going from solo to community, and there are just complexities there. And when you think about WordPress multi-site, I mean, like in a big one, like there's stuff going on continuously. It's not like your single install when you're like, oh, my last post update was, 3 weeks ago, so it doesn't matter if I don't have a recent backup. I can just overwrite all the stuff or I lose one post. Can't do that on the community site because who knows who you're impacting, and they're going to be really unhappy when they lose content if you were to do like a whole rollback.
And it takes a lot more communication.
Yeah. Managing an apartment, not a job I want, but that's more what that multi-site is. But cool stuff. You have cool neighbors. You get to see cool things. Maybe you're walking down the hallway, somebody offers you some cookies. There's some positives to being in the community.
Does it work on the city like sewage system, or do you have to have your own and get it all pumped out? Because that often matters with the hacks.
That may be taking the metaphor beyond where I'm able to do it.
Fair enough.
But I think what'll be helpful is maybe just taking a little tour of multi-site and seeing what it looks like as vanilla and how it kind of differs from single install. So I have a blank one. So just as an aside, and we'll provide a link or something to it, but like I use WP Local to do my local development work, and it's a really nice way to play around with stuff. And in this case, I just spun up a WordPress multi-site so that people could see it vanilla, and I'll also show you kind of my more messy live production site where I just throw a bunch of stuff. So here we are. It probably looks pretty familiar. I do want to draw your attention to a couple things. So because it's multi-site, by default, it's going to have this little My Sites icon in the corner. And as you get a lot of sites, it might look more like this. Something you want to be cautious about as a multi-site admin is how many of those sites you end up getting affiliated with. I think initially I had, I don't know, several hundred, and it really started bogging down my whole admin experience. I just, in frustration, one time created another account. But there are some other ways you can deal with that are a little less extreme. But it's one of those like, hey, heads up, don't become the admin on a whole bunch of sites and a member on a whole bunch of sites. You're an admin. You can just hop in. You don't need to be a member. But the majority of your work is going to be done here in Network Admin. So let's take a look. It's very exciting. I have one site and one user. I'll be able to see all the sites here. I can add new ones. Same deal with users. But let's look at our settings, because this is where you're going to make your first choices. As you see, registration. You can, on those polls, you can set registration to be entirely disabled, or you can set it so anyone can sign up for both sites and user accounts. These days, there are pretty good bots that will sign up for your stuff if you don't have any restrictions, and they will populate your multi-site with all sorts of spam of the most unpleasant nature. So I discourage people from leaving it wide open. Generally, what we do in educational settings is limit the email registrations to whatever your institution is, middlebury.edu or vcu.edu. And you can do a couple of them. Like at VCU, we had a medical campus and some other URLs that we added in there that were different. So we had, a couple domains there, but pretty simple thing to do. And when we needed to add people outside of that, a lot of times I just throw an extra domain in there, even if it was Gmail, sign the people up real quick, and then remove the email domain. Nothing too fancy there. I never bothered with banning email domains, just because it's easier to whitelist than to blacklist the names. Let's look at some of these other options because I skipped a few. So I did leave this on, send the network admin an email notification every time someone registers a site or user account. I did that out of paranoia. I didn't look at every single one of them, but I did set up an email filter so that they went to a particular folder, and I'd kind of scroll through there just as a way to keep a pulse on it. Maybe not the greatest way or the best idea, but sometimes I'd see a cool name, like a cool site name or a cool username, and I go see what they were doing. And other times, I was just kind of paranoid about people, I don't know, making something crazy that would get everyone in trouble. It didn't happen though. So, I mean, this is thousands and thousands of sites over many years, and we never had someone, like name themselves some sort of weird curse word, or have a site that was, grossly inappropriate or anything like that. So,
can I ask you a question on that, Tom?
Yeah.
In your experience, do you think that's because WordPress multisite is often associated with a user and their email? Hence, it's not like being anonymous and feeling like they can do whatever they want. Like there is a one-to-one in terms of you being able to see who did or created the site.
I think that was a part of it, certainly, because you are signing up with your real VCU email address. Now you can have your username and your display name be whatever you want it, that kind of pseudonymous public view. But I think at its root and at its core, we did know who the real person was behind that. But also, like, I don't know, a part of me likes to kind of believe a little bit that like people aren't as terrible as people kind of make them out to be, and they're not just going to do quite as many stupid things as instinctively as people might think. So maybe that's a bit naive, but I mean, I was really impressed. We only had, a handful of DMCA takedown requests in the entire time I worked at VCU with this. And one of them was like a bad request, and we were able to fight it, and the provost supported us, and we left the content up. And like that kind of stuff was super cool. And I think the majority of DMCA things we had were really faculty putting like course stuff up in a way that was a little too public. So that's kind of an interesting aspect to it that I don't think you really hear about. But you can set up registration in a lot of different ways. I mean, here you kind of have the default stuff that you can choose from. You can set up custom registration paths. You can set up registration and creation through something like Gravity Forms or a variety of other plugins and things that let you control what happens in registration in different ways, solicit additional information. And that's a really important and useful thing to think through as you come up with this.
Can I ask you on that add new users? Because I think that's the next one you're getting to. That was always a trick, right? Because add new users, even if you let admins of new WordPress sites that are created in the WordPress multi-site add users, are they limited to the users already in the user database, or to users with a vcu.edu, for example, domain? Or is this giving them more power to add anyone?
I think in this case, they can add from the existing users. And some of this, like, it gets a bit hazy for me because we made so many modifications early on. That enabled people to do stuff. I think though, if you're going to add a completely new to everything user, you're going to need to be a super admin. So that's my recollection on that. But I do think allowing site administrators to add the new users from the existing kind of repository of users is a good choice.
Yeah, I agree.
And you know, for everything that's here by default and is a rule by default, there are ways programmatically or through plugins that already exist to subvert that rule. So that's something to know, right? Like, nothing is ever absolute in this stuff. And you can kind of plot your own path if you care about individual pieces enough. And I encourage it. Here's something that people, I don't feel like, really customize quite the way they might, including myself. We did some of this, but like these new site settings, you have the ability to change the emails, to change what is the first post and page. You can set all this stuff up so that when a new site is created, and there are some plugins that even go beyond this, you're controlling all the stuff that's there. And you can have some fun with this. It's part of setting up the kind of culture of the site. I think Shannon asked in one of the forums, like, you know, how do you kind of onboard people? This is a beautiful opportunity to customize kind of that experience and to add, like, I don't know, links to a tutorial. Click here for a forum where we talk about this stuff. See some cool examples of X and Y. Like, customize this stuff. It's meant to be customized. It should be customized. It's how you're setting up kind of that first open the door experience. What's that like for your people?
It's interesting too, right? Because you could link to support documentation. You could have a getting started, 2-minute video that your culture creates. Like, just use that, because every person who creates a new site will see whatever you have there. I mean, it's also just strategic, right? For getting people up and running and understanding, okay, how do I get rid of that post now? Here's how you delete me, whatever it is. It's like a training that WordPress vanilla never does very well. It's just like, hello world, goodbye,
Right. And yeah, take advantage. Like, to me, it's like you're having a default thing happen. If you're not caring enough to control it and to shape it so that it helps you, then it's a really missed opportunity in my mind. And I feel that way with all of this. Just really be intentional. Keep thinking through, how do I make this feel the way I want? Where can I take advantage of things that are already happening and kind of tweak them in ways that are to my advantage? How do I save myself from a lot of pain? Be proactive with this stuff. You'll end up happier. I promise. A couple other quick things, like these are upload settings, which are not at all sexy or anything, but you're going to want to limit the size by totals. Really think through. This is part of considering, like, how big is this thing going to get? What does that mean if people max out the storage? They probably won't in most cases, and you can override it for individual pieces, but set a conservative site upload space here, and make it part of both the training and kind of how you're thinking about encouraging people to do what. Like, if you're saying like something really restrictive, like 10 megabytes or something like that, you could you could have part of your training. It's like when you're uploading video, put it on YouTube and embed it here. Do not upload video. You could remove you can remove the video file types from this upload category. You could set a max file size that was lower. Kind of take advantage of kind of some of this built-in stuff, but have it be parallel in your documentation so that people understand what their other options are. And we got pretty aggressive with allowing different file types. Like we got into, some of the 3D files, some weird stuff. So you can definitely expand this list in a lot of different ways. And you might have to, because educators tend to use some really non-standard file formats. But just, keep in mind that this is one gateway to those controls. And you can override those controls on individual sites. So that's an important thing to know. And then the last one on this generic screen is admin menus. You can make it so that admins of individual sites don't even see plugin as an option in the sidebar. That to me is one end of the polarity spectrum. And the other end is activating it and making 600 plugins available. So, I think activating it is good. You want to have a healthy ecosystem of plugins. Otherwise, kind of what's the point in my mind? But you don't want it to be overwhelming to individual users. You don't want so many plugins that your environment is always in chaos and you're kind of hopping around, putting out brush fires all the time. So that's something to think about.
Tom, I'm sure we'll get into plugins and some of the recommended kind of essential ones, but how do you communicate with your community what plugins are available? One of the struggles I had early on, and as they started to grow in number, it can be a long list, and people are was there a resource for that? Was there a way so people could kind of vet quickly? Here's the combo of plugins that create this site, or that was maybe not, but that was always something kind of seemingly what other tools try and fill the need of.
Yes, and I know a couple of plugins for plugin management in WordPress multi-site, some of which enable you to kind of group the plugins
Nice.
in particular ways. We didn't end up doing that on Rampages, honestly, because I just didn't end up having the time or energy to put into it to do it right. What we found too was we did do some of the here's a site, it uses this theme, these plugins to create this interaction. So we had kind of a repository of things like that you could see. It wasn't as good as I would like it to be, but we did have that in existence. I think if you look at the data for Rampages, most people don't activate a whole lot of plugins. That could be a failure of communication on our part, or a failure of education. But we would go through a lot of times. If we did in-class presentations, we would hit all right, here are 3 or 4 plugins we think you'll use because of what you're doing. And in faculty conversations, as we got down to the nitty gritty, that's when we would do a little more advocacy for plugins or themes. It's not as independent as I might like it to be, but that was probably the root of it. Were I doing it now, I think I would build a system such that you could look at a plugin and see all the public sites that are using it, as well as a little description of what it does, because that would be pretty easy to build in WordPress multi-site, and it'd be super cool. And I'd probably do that for themes. So you could do all sorts of neat combinations of that with the database that I think would be a lot of fun.
And it would be kind of ability to tour people through, Here's why you might want to use that. And then here's how people use this cocktail of plugins and themes to create a podcasting site or a video site, right? Like really start thinking broadly about templating and packaging it, because I think WordPress, obviously, immensely powerful tool, immensely popular. But if you don't give people some very specific guidelines to how they can use these tools, it will be underutilized often. Or they'll say, okay, I can't do it, you know?
Absolutely. It's again that line, like trying to figure out, like, what do you have the people and time to do? What's going to make the biggest impact for you? You know, are you really pushing this hard? Because I mean, one of the things people often say this does is creates digital fluency. Well, what do you mean by that? What is that? How are you going to see it here? Because I mean, if you got a WYSIWYG editor or Gutenberg, then like, you know, are you creating digital fluency? You know, what is that? Are you having people look at the HTML? You know, are they figuring out what plugins do, and you know, really leveraging the database aspect of WordPress to create content and structure in ways that you couldn't with just a flat HTML page? Like, those are the kind of questions you want to think through, and you want to think through how plugins align to that and what sort of things they allow people to do that are kind of above and beyond. And that's all part of you thinking through the culture and the focus of your site, or your community as a whole. You'll note that I have clicked on the add new site piece, so I can do that as a super admin. You'll note mine is creating things in a subdirectory. The reason I choose subdirectory on this one is because it's easier on local dev. So, but that's one of your initial setup choices. Do I want to be subdirectory or subdomain? And the difference for everybody is like, you know, my address is mutist.local. So with subdirectory, this will become mutist.local/foo. With subdomain, it'd be foo.mutist.local. And that stands for MU test. But in any case, that's a choice. We want subdirectories in RAM pages for a variety of reasons. Nowadays, like, you'll see people arguing about SEO stuff around subdirectories versus subdomains and a lot of different stuff. The reason I encourage subdirectories in our case is we wanted to kind of have it be RAM pages first, because you're part of that community, rather than leading with the individual and then having the community kind of aspect come afterwards. So you could argue either point, certainly. If your multi-site is installed in a subdirectory, you're going to have to use subdirectories. Another thing is subdomains can give you some hassles with SSL certificates, and if you're doing any sort of CDN caching and some technical things like that, sometimes subdomains can be a little bit harder. But I'm sure the Jim can maybe talk more about that if problems occur.
The thing we have run into that. Meredith has become like our resident expert on getting wildcard SSL working with WordPress multi-site for subdomains. And it's a separate certificate that isn't necessarily one you can get directly for free through Let's Encrypt. But you're right, it adds a layer of complexity, subdomains, to actually getting SSL. I've always preferred subdomains because early on you could map a domain easily to a subdomain. So you could have jimgroom.rampages.us, but then say jimgroom.com as an easy mapping. But I don't think that's really matters anymore. You can do that with subdirectories as well as subdomains. So it really is a matter of preference and where you're kind of setting up now. There used to be an argument for it, I thought, but I don't even know if there is, other than preference and maybe some complexity with SSL.
Yeah. And these days, like mapping a custom domain to these is, if anyone deeply cares about it, like that to me is the option. If you want to go outside of the whatever it is that we decided on, cool, get your own domain. It's not that much. You can point it at it. And as you saw while we were talking, I created that site. I do want to show you one thing real quick here. When I click edit site, this is the WordPress multi-site type of editing. So I could change the URL. I could even lie and say when it was created. I've got some attributes I can apply to it. I can even customize this list in the end if I want to, although I think it takes programming. But it's one way you might keep track of the sites. Like say that there was an option for course here, or portfolio, or whatever you want. But that possibility is there. I can see the people associated with the site and add them centrally or remove them. Here is where I can add themes at the multi-site level, invisible to anyone. And this is where I would enable them for the individual sites, should I choose to do it that way. That can be nice in that you can have a lot more themes, or a theme that has one license and is paid, and you don't make it visible to people. You just activate it for an individual site. And that's a really nice option. And then there are the just basic settings where you can come back here and change some stuff. This is going to look like, if you're familiar with the database, this should look kind of familiar. And look, this is where you can override the default space quota. So not terribly exciting, but functional and really handy when you're managing sites. And then if I wanted to add a user, let me add one real quick. I used to not understand why programmers used foo and bar. In this case, it didn't work for me. But it saves you from having to think of something complex when you're doing stuff. So now I've got a user. I can reset their password if I needed to. I can send them the link for it. It's just really nice. I can control all that. I could even change their settings if I needed to. And then they just show up as a user. There they are. And I can delete them and control them all. And you can see in this case, they're not assigned to any sites. But I can do that easily enough.
So Tom, one of the questions we get a lot early on is, with settings for WordPress multi-site, the upload file limit, and where you would change that and where you would override. So you have the files, which comes up, and you pointed to that, but there's that max upload file size. Right. One heads up, whether you host through Reclaim or whatever, you can change it here, but you also might have to change it on the server in PHP settings. So if that is an issue, wherever you're hosting your WordPress multi-site, keep that in mind, because we get that question a lot, and it's a good one, because you're like, I changed it to 150 megabytes, and I'm still only able to do 1,500 kilobytes. And so keep that in mind. That's an old gold question that I still have to think about twice as you were going through this, to say, oh yeah, that's right, you got to change it at the server.
Absolutely. The php.ini file, right? INI, can override all this stuff, and they can be hidden in weird places. And sometimes I feel like you need to put one every folder directory. It can be a little frustrating.
And it's a good reminder, because a lot of a WordPress multi-site really is, when you're running it, and we're thinking about scale. And a lot of the questions we'll get into over the course of the month, right? A question is like, is this going to be running in a shared hosting site? Is it going to be running on its own server? And often that PHP INI is an indicator of, this instance, and how you scale it is reflective of the resources at the edge of the server, whether it's storage, whether it's CPU, and, it will grow and expand probably quickly beyond shared hosting. So that's a good reminder, is that, yeah, this is linked to a server that has specific settings to limit the amount of uploads that are happening, etc. So anyway, that's a friendly reminder from your local host, right?
No. Yeah, excellent point. And back to that kind of apartment building metaphor, like we can give you a thermostat that cranks up to 120, but you're going to be bound to some degree by the heating system of the building, and kind of, if everybody's trying to run it to 120, we're going to blow things up pretty quick. So you keep thinking through, like, well, how do I make reasonable settings at the individual level? When do I allow people to go outside them? How do I accomplish goals without kind of destroying or taxing the whole system in ways that are unsustainable? Like, that's what makes it harder, but it's also a system you can control and see, and people you can talk to and work things out. So, it's worth, I think, the cost of some of that. The one quick difference too I want to show about themes is, like, there are 3 themes installed here. Only one is network enabled. So if I went to an individual site, and this is literally how I do it as an admin, I only see one theme in here. So if I go back to themes and I network enable, notice how it's gone blue too, and then go back to sites, appearance. Now I've got 2 of them. So that's a little bit different. It feels a little bit different. But again, is handy because it lets you kind of have more themes on hand as options, but not necessarily show all of that complexity. The same thing does not apply for plugins.
It doesn't. I was thinking it did. I'm glad you said that.
No, let's add Classic Editor. I don't know why I would choose that one, or why 5 million other people would choose that one.
Thank you for pointing that out.
In this case, like, check this out. And this is something that has always bothered me. So if I go to the dashboard here, it's there. But you wouldn't think that it would be. And network activate here means it's going to turn it on in a way that can't be turned off for all of the sites on your network. So that's it's like almost the same language, network enable versus network activate, but entirely different actions on things that are right next to each other that you would think would behave in the same way. So that's important to know.
Exactly. That's a little bit of a trap built
Yes,
into WordPress multisite.
it really is. And I'll go into WordPress multi-sites and I'll be like, why the hell are there like 30 network activated plugins? Like, what is going on? And that was the cause.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely be aware of that. You will notice too, like, as you think this through, decide whether things are going to be auto updating or not. Your plugins, your themes. Are you going to do that sort of stuff every month? What's that testing going to look like? There's a lot of stuff involved here to think through. But now I feel like we've kind of established a decent initial tour of what this would look like as you sign up and how to start messing with things. Is there anything that y'all note that I missed? Anything we need to hit harder?
I wonder if one of the things to talk about is the various flavors of WordPress, right? Like things that you would, I don't know, how would we say, couple with WordPress multisite, whether it be like BuddyPress or.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to note, is that people have done a lot with the multi-site kind of platform to build on top of it. BuddyPress is one of the older, better known ones that kind of makes it more like a social network. It does things like create community streams. It does some user profile stuff that's pretty nice. User groups. I think it works with, is it BB Press to do some forum stuff. it starts to feel a lot more socially than default WordPress. It does, or at least it did back in the day, take a bit more resources. So it's something you want to do with intention. It changes the default sign-up process to some degree. I remember back in the day when we turned it on, Gardner Campbell did not like the BuddyPress versus WordPress thing, so we had to go to great lengths to kind of take control of the sign-up process and make it more like the initial WordPress. There's Commons in a Box, which is more of an academic bent from the CUNY people. They now have 2 flavors, Classic and Open Lab. And it has kind of some more academia leanings, some OER type of focus. There's some stuff like that. There's things like Pressbooks, which is all about creating OER textbooks, and it uses WordPress Multisite as the foundation. It's important to note that with any of these, I think LearnDash is another option. When you activate these plugins, they have to be turned on at the network level. They impact every site on the network, and that can be good. It can also, be bad. Like Pressbooks, you pretty much are just going to run a Pressbooks install. Don't try and do anything else. LearnDash, I kind of feel the same way. BuddyPress and Commons in a Box are a little less intrusive, in my opinion. They more augment WordPress rather than kind of take it over and make it do something almost entirely different than what it started out doing. But it's one of those things you kind of think through, like, again, what's my site? What do I want it to do? Are there things that help me do that? What are those things? And it doesn't make sense to do that for every site on this network. Any other pieces I'm missing here that seem like it took care of the flavors?
You're muted, Jim.
Muted and Jitsi. Those are some of the flavors I can think of with WordPress Multisite that come in. LearnDash, I have supported it with people who had it installed, but I've never seen it in the multi-site or seen what it does. But I know it does kind of change the whole look and feel of the site. I mean, I wonder, a lot of schools won't have this problem, but like WooCommerce would be another one, right? Like tools like Gravity Forms. Like there are some powerful plugins, right? Now it's a distinction between like, there are like apps within apps, like Commons in a Box, Pressbooks, and LearnDash. And then there are some that are right on the border, right? That are started as plugins and then became full-blown like apps of their own. And we'll probably cover some more of that. But like that's a good overview of a lot of those.
Well, and the line I would draw there is like Gravity Forms is going to provide you a limited tool set to create very particular types of interactions. These, what I'll call flavorers, kind of impact the possibilities across the spectrum of the site. So that's kind of how I'd talk about the difference. Gravity Forms adds a tool to the tool belt. These flavoring things kind of change the entire tool belt to some degree. They're altering and expanding things with kind of a very opinionated view about what the WordPress site should do in the long run and how people are going to be using it. So that's kind of the difference that I see between them.
Like Gutenberg. I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm sorry. I have no flag to bear here. I promise.
I do.
No, but I think in the next session, we will look towards stuff like vision, aligning some of the goals you have for these, and looking more broadly about here's the overview. How are you going to do this and make this work for your community? What are you coming to with it? And as a result, what would you need to make it work specifically in that context? Does that make
Right.
sense, Amanda and Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're getting, again, from vanilla install and just roughly understanding what our landscape is to how do we start to customize this? But we have to know where we're going. Otherwise, like, what's the point? And, you know, higher ed institutions with projects like these have differing degrees of requirements. And what we want to make sure is like we're doing everything we can to make this easy for you so that you can prove success, so that you can have happy people and you can spend your time doing stuff that's actually like fun and interesting instead of like SSL certificate wildcards. Like that would suck. Who wants to do that? So like, you know, I think that's the deal is you try and lessen all the hassle. And focus on proving that you're awesome so you get money no matter who's in charge of what.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Tom. This was great. And we will wrap it up here and excited for the rest of the sessions. Stay tuned.
Thank you.